In my 6 months of working with NASA, I've noticed a theme or a set of themes running through my conversations with project managers, engineers, and administrators. And those themes are the importance of collaboration, communication, trust, and sharing of expertise. I heard it from folks who belong to the Fabrication Alliance, which is a cooperative group of people in manufacturing functions in the different centers who had found a way to share work by moving it to the center that was the best at doing it, and also to travel around and learn from each other. I heard it from people working on a project called HITEX, a hypersonic reentry vehicle, who said that even though that was never built, the project was canceled about a year and a half in, that project stood out in their minds because of the incredible cooperation and sharing of knowledge and information among the 5 centers plus the DOE and the Department of Defense involved in that. I've had conversations with Chris Scalise and Michael Coates at Johnson, and most recently with Rex Gevitin. And there, too, the theme of their message is that for NASA to accomplish its very demanding and ambitious new missions, the organization is going to have to be very good at sharing learning among the centers, at collaboration among all the centers. I raise that now because it's really an insight to what I'm talking about, and I know what Larry's talking about, when we're talking about knowledge management. In a lot of people's minds, knowledge management is document repositories, data mining, and similar systems. That's mainly not what I'm talking about and not what we're interested in. And I think the easiest way maybe to give a kind of capsule idea of what the difference is to say that knowledge and information are 2 different things. And knowledge management really originated some 10 plus years ago by people saying, you know, the promise of information management doesn't seem to be fulfilling itself. It was supposed to make great decisions and do this and that, and it's not doing it. And a number of people, including Larry and Tom Davenport and Tom Stewart, Professor Nanaka in Japan, started saying, you know, it's not really about information, it's about knowledge. Now, since then, we in knowledge management have wasted unbelievable amounts of time parsing those definitions and saying what's knowledge, what's information, because they do sort of blend in the middle. But I don't want to work in the middle, because the essential point here is that when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about a sum total, usually contained in a group or in a person, of experience, information, wisdom, understanding. We're talking about what I would call know-how as opposed to, say, know what. The know-how of being an engineer is different, and how to solve an engineering problem is different from having a lot of engineering facts. Just as the know-how of being a lawyer is different from memorizing what's in the law books. It's kind of practice that people learn from each other. And the main concern of the type of knowledge management I'm mainly talking about today is about people learning from each other those deeper skills of how to understand a practice, how to understand the talents and skills of problem solving, how to communicate to each other the kinds of learnings and the kinds of expertise that are hard to put in a document. So what we're talking about is a focus on people, on practices and values. During Nancy's talk, people were saying one of the barriers to better communication was a lack of trust. And I would add a lack of respect, either for superiors and subordinates. So trust and respect are essential ingredients for effective knowledge transfer. We're talking about conversation, again, as in Nancy's things, and storytelling. We're talking about work environments that allow people to meet with each other in different ways and see each other at work and kind of understand what's happening at work. So technology matters in this, our email, our repositories, our databases, but I think as an assist and an enabler, a way of exchanging knowledge a little more widely, a way of keeping groups together when they can't meet all the time. But I would argue that the technology should always be seen as the assistant of these more human issues. And if you're choosing whether to put your attention into the trust or the technology, put it into the trust. And the technology will almost take care of itself. So, as you can see here, there's a list: face-to-face meetings, after-action reviews, communities of practice, mentoring, workspace design. All of these are aspects of knowledge management, and more appropriately, we've never liked the word knowledge management, of how people learn from each other and collaborate effectively in organizations. Now, as Tina mentioned, I've done this little work at Babson College, basically deciding after 10 years or so of the practice of knowledge management, wondering whether we'd actually learned anything that we could feel fairly confident in. 10 years of trial and error. What have we learned that we think really defines the best kinds of practices in this area? So I did a couple of dozen interviews with people in a dozen organizations, talked to some gurus, some familiar names, neglected, not only to my shame, but to my loss, to talk to Nancy, though she was quoted by another of the gurus, to try to see where we are, what do we feel confident about in these practices, and what do we think we still need to learn or think about to make organizational knowledge sharing and collaboration more effective. So that's what I set out to do, and I'm going to run through some of the findings of these conversations and observations. One I've already suggested. A dominant focus on IT solutions to knowledge problems always equals failure, 100% of the time. People I talked to said things like, the rocks are strewn with the wrecks of projects based on thinking IT tools will change the world. And anyone here, I'm sure Nancy would vouch for this, anyone here who's worked in knowledge management has dozens or hundreds of stories of organizations that set up a document sharing system thinking they were doing knowledge management and having that system fail again and again and again. In spite of that fact, and in spite of what you think could be a demonstration of the truth of this, this seems to be a lesson that has to be made over and over and over again. I think there's some reasons for this. One is technology is cool. We like it, and there's someone always coming along saying, well, that last thing didn't work, but I've got a new thing that's better, and it's going to work. Second, in this country at least, we kind of like easy, simple, push-the-button solutions. You know, it's the 3 steps to losing weight, being handsome, and making $1 million all in the next month. And technology seems to offer that, whereas if you say to people, well, it's about your processes and practices, it's about trust, it's about culture, as well as technology, that's a lot messier and harder to get your hands on. But many of the successful and experienced practitioners I've talked to, when I've said, okay, on the projects that worked, how much attention, how much money are you giving to technology, how much to other things? Several of them said the ideal would be 25% of effort to technology, 75% to process, organization, practice, and culture. The technology tends to creep up, but everyone agrees on this one. Okay, number 2. You really need to involve, if you're, say, a knowledge management group or an IT group working on this, you really need to involve the users of what you're building, whether it's a process with technology, in the development of that process for two main reasons. One, we're talking about skilled knowledge work, which is different in different places, which is very context dependent. So only those people really know what their work is about. If you're an IT person helping them, you don't know. You have to find out from them what they need and how they work. And also, as we all know, and project managers I'm sure know, by involving people in a decision-making process, you make them want to do the work. They don't feel something is being imposed on them. They don't feel some outsider is coming in and doing things. They become part of the project. So, for instance, in one large organization I talked to where they were building a sharing system, they had 6 months of testing with 1,000 managers. 1,000 managers were doing the beta test. And it was not that they needed 1,000 managers to uncover the problems with the system, but they saw it as an opportunity to make those people part of the work and to engage them in what was going on. I've seen numbers of cases, one at Oracle in Europe, where jointly developing communities of practice, inviting people to connect with people of similar interest, and a technical infrastructure of email and messaging and document storage and online workspaces that would support it. Doing those things together really works well. They help you design the workspace, you help them foster the community. Working together is very different from knocking on the door and saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, and here's your knowledge system, you better use it. And that can lead to a kind of evolutionary model where nothing in the way knowledge sharing works is fixed. It develops over time as people use it, as they develop their practices and as they begin to understand what they need. Okay, here's a no-brainer one. Tom Davenport hates this because he said, well, of course you need senior management support. Why even mention it? Without senior managers supporting knowledge sharing, it doesn't happen much. It happens in groups that are fortunate enough to have found a good way to work for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of effective knowledge sharing needs to cross boundaries between groups, departments, and organizations, and only senior people generally have the ability to say, let's get together and do this. The second point is people's time is limited. Unless your bosses think it's of value for you to share what you know with other people and take time to learn from other people, it's going to go down on the list unless you really need it. You just won't do it that much. So this is absolutely essential. And in places like the World Bank, where we saw for 6 or 7 years tremendous senior management support for knowledge sharing, burgeoning of communities, wonderful stories about information circling the globe from one of the World Bank's places to another. When that support kind of died out and the money, little bit of money supporting it was taken away, the knowledge efforts didn't disappear. They just kind of tailed off. They became quieter. Half the communities kind of dried up and went away. So this is really important. And I would say, fortunately, in NASA, unless people are really handing me a line, this exists in spades. Everyone seems to realize that learning and sharing learning within NASA is absolutely essential. So those are three, what I would call pretty basic findings. Let me talk about a few that are a little more complex, perhaps. One of the debates that's gone on in knowledge management from the beginning is, okay, is the aim to collect a lot of very valuable material and put it someplace where people can find it? Or is the aim to connect people with each other so that you'll find a way to go to the person who knows about something that you know? And to the extent that it's been a debate, the sort of information-y knowledge people have been on the document side, and the knowledge-y people have been on the no, you got to connect people side. What I've found in numbers of organizations that I think are having great success is that this is a false dichotomy. That the best knowledge systems, and the two exemplary ones I think of is one at McKinsey and one at MITRE, absolutely combine these two functions. There are places to go to for documents that you may need to get some background, to get key detailed information that are completely integrated with access to the people who know the most. So if you're in the MITRE system and you say, okay, well, I got a project starting, something to do with satellites. Let's see who in MITRE's done work recently having to do with satellites. You would type your keywords into the system. You would get a list of however many documents, and on the side you would get a list of people derived from their contribution of those documents and the system's tracking of who had worked on what project for how long and how recently. So you have both things, and in both of these cases, the systems are used a bit for documents, more for people contact, but it brings together those two functions. So the early years of knowledge management, we had what people were calling yellow pages. Sometimes they were actual books where you'd look up people according to skills, and document repositories. In a lot of places, these come together. And the most successful cases, the expertise location depends on what's in the system and not people reporting what they're experts in. So one of the persons I talked to said self-evaluation expertise locators are a visible and colossal failure. People aren't always best at saying what they're good at, surprisingly. The systems get out of date if they depend on people going back and saying, well, now I've worked on this. Those things just don't work. Let me skip down to number 4, which I think is a really interesting one and probably relevant to NASA. This is not one that I expected. A couple of places said their knowledge sharing work really took off when they were able to get people to share work that was not complete and that was not perfect. In one case, it was a software company that encouraged people to put these fairly primitive new little software things up for other people to use and adapt. In other cases, it was documents and reports that might just be in the form of notes or some unfinished story. Places have found that if the expectation is that what you're sharing is perfect, is the best you can make it, much less gets shared. And in fact, the organization benefits much more from people being willing to share work in progress and being willing to help to essentially put themselves on the line to help each other in situations where they have partial knowledge. So here's another trust issue. If you think you're in a cutthroat organization where mistakes are punished or where everyone is keeping a mental register of the smartest person in the organization, followed by the second smartest, followed by the third smartest, you're not going to share your late night thoughts. Or in the case of some of the things Nancy was talking about, your suspicion that there may be something wrong but you can't quite put your finger on. So that's a bar to knowledge sharing. But trust allows people to share things that are unfinished and really have a much more lively exchange of knowledge. And I'm sure within your project experience, you know that once people trust each other, they can go to each other and say, I'm not really sure about this, but makes a huge difference. Okay. A couple of the barriers, few of the barriers that are cultural barriers to knowledge exchange, whether... Yeah.
Excuse me, I think Michael was just trying to get
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious about what kind of systems are you talking about, since you're not talking about data, just get your information.
That's a good point, because I am partly talking about databases, but I'm talking about them as an adjunct system. So let me describe.
Maybe. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. I mean, for instance, the system at MITRE, the example I gave, someone wants information on work done recently on government contracts related to some aspect of satellite work. If I'm searching on that, I will find reports and documents and maybe pointers to software. I will find documentary stuff, and that stuff does matter. But it's in conjunction with the people stuff. So it's both. It's both things. And if I overstated the case at the beginning, which I probably did, saying not systems but people, that's an overstatement. But I'm partly saying that the systems only work and only have value when the people stuff is working right. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, you'd be interested.
Pardon? So the kinds of barriers that make these exchanges, whether they're the exchanges of documents in system or person to person, are people in organizations saying we're really good at collecting things, but we don't use them well. We need to have people come after the things. An especially huge problem with the big issue for NASA and a lot of other organizations of having knowledgeable senior people nearing retirement wanting some way to pass on or capture what they know. There are organizations that spend a huge effort doing things like videotaping people who have a lot of wisdom on the valid grounds that, well, a videotape carries more context and emotion than just trying to write a report. But then nobody looks at the videotapes. Internal competition is potentially a serious problem. If parts of an organization are competing for resources, if how they do this year relative to another part of the organization affects their standing next year, it's harder to share across organizations that way. In organizations where sharing is devalued, either not invented here syndrome or just a sense of stick to your work and do it, these things don't work well. Okay. A lot of knowledge management work, especially work in the systems, is efficiency work. It's an attempt to consolidate resources in the organization and also to create a kind of unified organization, presenting one face to customers or to the public. So there are companies that create portals that kind of establish the rules and the vocabulary for the organization. That's one push in a lot of knowledge management efforts. But the counter pressure, which I mentioned in passing before, is standardizing is a straitjacket on people who are doing unique work. If you put everyone into the same box, then you're not giving them useful knowledge and you're forcing them to waste time that should be spent in their work and in sharing knowledge. So in the situations I've seen that work, there's a balance between a sense of what the organization as a whole needs, usually leads towards some sort of system, and the need to personalize, to be flexible, for the systems to evolve. Earlier I talked about the need to engage users in creating their own knowledge-sharing tools, whether it's an online shared workspace or a repository or a way that they meet together. That obviously runs counter to sameness in the organization, and I think tolerance for differences is very important. The evolution of allowing these systems and ways of behaving to evolve also, sort of like the evolution of the airplanes at the museum the other day. I mean, it looks like you let people go wild and you have 10,000 different shapes of flying machines. You may not want to go that far, but knowledge sharing in organizations also should be allowed to evolve. An example from the MITRE system, which also touches on the issue I raised about the importance of unfinished work. When the IT people at MITRE first built what they envisioned as a knowledge sharing system, they put in something called a publish folder. And the idea was that when I finished a report or a white paper or whatever it was, I could put it in this publish folder and other people could use keywords to find it. They also had something called a transfer folder, which just meant that if I'm on one side of the building and you're on the other side of the building and I want to send you a big document, rather than attaching it to email, I would dump it in the transfer folder. Or if I'm in Boston, I'm flying to Washington to give a talk, I can dump my presentation into the transfer folder, pick it up down in Washington. Well, what MITRE found was that nobody used the publish folder because they felt that some high level of quality was being demanded and that those documents were going to be judged in some way. But the transfer folder, which was much more casual, got a huge amount of use and became the kind of exchange place of documents and other materials. So what the people at MITRE wisely did, instead of saying, no, this is a report, it goes in the publish folder, was they killed the publish folder. They just said, okay, this other thing works great, transfer folder works great, the publish folder doesn't work, we'll take it out, forget it. So that kind of evolution, I think, is very important. Okay, skip that. You want to skip this? Yeah, no, we'll do this. One of the ways that people in knowledge management have driven themselves crazy over the last 10 years is worrying about measuring the value of knowledge. From the first day people were talking about this, they said, okay, if we're going to invest in this stuff, how do we figure out how much it's worth? And early on, some people tried to see how valuable the knowledge itself was, and that led absolutely nowhere. Many people tried to do a kind of return on investment, which was sometimes based on things like, well, our consultant was able to finish his client presentation in 1 week instead of 4 weeks because this material was available and he could find someone to talk to. He bills at such and such an hour. Therefore, we've saved $100,000 on this. Tom Davenport said, this is not credible, really. Partly, I mean, efficiency matters, but first of all, we don't know how people are spending that saved time. It's like in Massachusetts when there were people arguing for right turn on red, and the fact that you could save, I don't know, between 5 and 20 seconds sometimes by being able to turn right on a red light. People said things like, we're losing $1 billion in productivity because of all of this time spent waiting at the red light. As if we would take the 20 seconds and come up with a brilliant idea or do a report. So that doesn't work. I would say the most interesting thing in the measurement issue is that there's a powerful link between the support of senior leaders and the need to measure. When senior leaders believe that knowledge sharing is important, they don't demand return on investment or mathematical proofs of value. The senior VP of Oracle in Europe, who was a supporter of the knowledge program, when the knowledge guy came to him and said, do you want me to come every 6 months and give you some figures on what we're saving? He said, you don't tell if a tree is growing by pulling it out of the ground and looking at the roots every 6 months. He was essentially saying, we believe this is important. We believe that if people are using the systems and processes you're creating, if we hear stories that their work is enhanced, that's enough. So to some extent, I mean, this is not that people won't get better about measuring knowledge value in useful ways in the future, and it may be useful to do. But this is a problem which seemed huge and which has become much less huge over time.
But you obviously don't need it.
Oh, thank you. Need it for the recorder. Okay, here's Nancy's quote. In the early days of excitement over knowledge stuff, the idea seemed to be the more knowledge people had, the more you could collect, the more you could share, the better it was. There was a lot of knowledge out there. Let's just connect it all up, and something good will come of it. That doesn't work. It's inefficient. People tend to know when they're spending time trying to learn something that's not of value to them. So I think what we've learned over the years is you need to focus your knowledge exchange efforts on something that matters. Tom Stewart of Harvard Business Review quoted Nancy saying, look at knowledge management from the question in. Don't start with the answer, because the answer is going to be, let's get more knowledge. Say, what is it we're trying to do? What problem are we trying to solve? In other words, some sort of clarity of purpose. Then you can say, what knowledge do we need to solve this problem? What knowledge do we need to do the work that we know we're going to have to do in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? At that point, you can do a kind of gap analysis saying, okay, what have we got? And what are we lacking? And how do we get it? And pursue the knowledge you don't have. What are we after? What do we need? What's valuable? And when Dorothy Leonard, for instance, who writes about what she calls deep smarts, the really deep experiential knowledge that some people in organizations have, and how difficult it is to pass that on, that it can only be passed on really through mentoring, through guided learning, through shadowing people, very high labor work. The answer to people who say is, well, we don't have time for that work, is you don't have to do it for everybody. There are some senior people that you can say, thank you very much, and enjoy your retirement. And others that you can learn something from, and then key people you can identify as really having essential knowledge that is worth almost anything you need to do to pass on. Okay, I got a couple of minutes left here. Here's something relevant to you. It was clear from all of my conversations that having a higher purpose, and by that I mean a higher purpose than earning money, enhances knowledge sharing. That people are much readier to help each other, to share what they know, to spend time to document important things, if they feel that they have a mission that really matters. If they feel they're doing something other than making some more millions from the organization. Dave LaCrone, after his talk, we were talking at the table here before, he said, the best motivation is the work itself. And I think that's true. Both the interest of the work, which he was mainly talking about, and a sense of purpose. I think we had a sense of that throughout the Hubble talk, that this was such an amazing bit of science that was just changing the way people understood and looked at the universe, that it was worth any effort to make it go right. So when I say this to business organizations, I say, look at the aspects of your work that aren't just about money. Because even though, say, pharmaceuticals companies are in the business for profit, and some of us think maybe for too much profit, they are also doing important, interesting, valuable work, and you can emphasize this. And I would say within NASA, and this ties in with things people have kind of hinted at last night and today, probably the job of administrators and project managers is partly to remind the team how important and exciting the work is, how valuable the mission is, because that not only pushes people to work harder and do their best, but I think from all that I've observed really makes them less ego-driven, I think as someone said before, and more collaborative. Okay, let's see. Let's skip most of that. I just want to talk about a couple of things on this as my last slide. I ask people when I talk to them, okay, we've talked about what we're doing well. What do you think we need to do in the future of making organizational knowledge sharing and organizational learning work well? What do you think we need to do that we're not doing much? Tom Davenport says, rather than think of everyone in the organization as the same, really think about individual roles and the knowledge that those roles need and focus your efforts. He pointed to Intel as a place that's beginning to do that. Okay, so that's one. A second, Larry Prusak and I are very interested in this one. People talk about the technology of knowledge exchange. People talk about work spaces, workplaces. People talk about the cultural aspects and the organizational aspects of knowledge. I think it's really important to look at these things all together, to begin to say, okay, how does the technology of information sharing and communication technology, how does that fit in with the cubicles and offices that people work in? Can those things enhance each other? For one example, I know a firm that does bond trading. So everyone has terminals giving up to the floods of up-to-minute information on what's happening in the market so they can make these very quick decisions on what to buy and what to sell. And their ability to do that, there are people located together in a room a little smaller than this. Their ability to really understand what's going on partly comes from what's flooding from their screen to them, but partly from the body language of other people in the room. And if they see people at another desk getting excited about something, that gives them information that they can use. If they see the people in the corner who are the tech guys, the IT guys, getting up and doing things, that leads them to say, well, maybe the information coming in my terminal is not up to date because there's something wrong with the system. So one thing this organization did was take the computer monitors and bury them in the desks so that people could look at that and look around the room at the same time and have two sources of information coming at them at once. Interesting thing that people don't do. So I think we need to take a larger look at this. I'm past my time, so I won't talk about the next one. Transferring deep smarts, I mentioned Dorothy Leonard, who maybe sometime we'll get to talk at one of these and who's featured in Ask, has talked to NASA and other organizations about how you make sure you don't lose this important knowledge when people walk out the door. And finally, expanding the knowledge sharing network to partners and customers. This, I would say, is something that NASA does better than most organizations in the world, because you have worked for decades with contractors, with other parts of the government. You've had these huge projects that involve many different organizations. As you know, and as people have said, there's huge value to this because you're trying to bring together a vast amount of expertise that cannot just be in one place. Even if there is a renewed focus on internal knowledge, there's still a lot that you'll need to know. Businesses are slower to do this, but beginning to, and I think one of the things we want to think about in knowledge issues is how do you make those cross-organizations connections better. Okay, I kind of rushed through this, but are there any questions? Yeah.
I just noticed, something you said, you had a chart that said a higher purpose encourages knowledge sharing. And I would almost say knowledge sharing encourages the higher purpose or the connectedness, because when people share knowledge, they trust others, they get it, then they feel connected to where you're going and what you're doing. And kind of one example just of how we don't maybe do that well is someone was talking over here about the administrator has some books that he's recommending people to read. And I'm a senior person at Goddard. I didn't know he had any books that he was recommending to read. So there we go. I'm finding out here that there's books or something that the administrator is reading. So people can either read that and understand what his thoughts are, understand what his goals are. But stuff like that is stuff that I find doesn't somehow make its way to the full organization. And that's something that needs to improve.
Yeah, that's good. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we talk sometimes about vicious circles of a negative feedback loop, but they're also what some people call virtuous circles. And knowledge sharing is one of those, because knowledge sharing builds trust. Trust enhances knowledge sharing. And you can go around that. And your example of the mission, sharing knowledge about the mission increases the sense of the value of the mission, which increases the knowledge sharing. Absolutely true. Yeah.
Actually, just wanted to quick speak. I was going to mention the administrator suggestion network. Actually, within the last 2 weeks, we're starting through Apple. It'll be up on the website soon. What we're calling Classics in Aerospace and Engineering Literature Initiative. And it started with these 5 books from the administrator. It will be branching out further. And we're going to use Apple to communicate these to the rest of the community. And so hopefully it will become easier to get this information. But literally we're just rolling this out in the last 2 weeks.
Other questions? Yeah.
Last one question. It seems as though you look at knowledge sharing and knowledge management as within a specific period of time. How do you then get the sense that you link by having significant gaps, like decades, between an activity that's generating a lot of knowledge between the next activity that you need to utilize or take advantage of that knowledge gain, such as developing the next major flight system? It's been decades since we've been in that mode. How do you propose to link that together, other than try to utilize the senior folks that were there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of effort going on now to bring back Apollo era people, and I know that the team that's doing a kind of initial look at the CEV design has some Apollo era people talking to them, but you don't have everybody. It's a long time ago, and retrospective understanding is very different from understanding in the moment. The stories that people end up telling are tailored to
reinvent history.
Yeah, we all reinvent history, I think, almost minute by minute to tell the stories to make our lives seem to make sense. So, I don't think there's any answer to what can we do now about what we didn't capture in the 60s and early 70s, except what's being done. But for the future, and in fact, Chris Scalise was talking about this, he said, we have to realize that the work that we're doing now is on machines that are going to be flying for the next 20, 30, 50 years, and that the decisions we make now are going to have to be understood by a generation of NASA people who are probably in elementary school or in kindergarten at this point. I can't give a whole answer, but 2 parts of the answer that I can give is, one, if the organization can get itself into the practice, into the habit of what the Army calls after-action reviews, where after any major event, milestone, a launch, the people involved say, as people in the Army do, okay, what did we expect to happen in this process? What actually happened? What did we learn from that? And that they learn that themselves and record as much as they can of that in documents. that context and that immediate response, I think, can be very useful. I would say the other major thing I can imagine for helping keep this knowledge alive is to be very intentional in people's career paths, not only, as Gus was saying earlier, in terms of making sure they have a satisfying, progressive career that matches their talents, but watching their path around the organization into different parts and different kinds of the organization so that they can be creators of networks of people and spreaders of knowledge. I mean, one of the great things about these long careers people have at NASA is at the end they have huge networks of people who are scattered in the centers. And I think you can create a kind of living body of knowledge that gets passed down if you're paying that kind of attention, if you're doing the mentoring and the passing on. And I think you need to do both. You need to record what you can, say not only this is the circuit we designed, but this is why we designed this one and not that one, and keep the human networks as healthy and as robust as possible.